You know how just by looking at something, anything, you instantly know what it is?
Hmm.
Is it a plant? Is it a tool? Is it, dare I say, a really enthusiastic toaster?
Yeah, we do it constantly.
We do this effortlessly, thousands of times a day. We categorize the world, understand what objects are, how they relate to each other, what we can do with them.
Right.
It feels simple, automatic, almost magical, but it relies on incredibly complex representations bubbling beneath the surface of our conscious thought, deep inside our brains.
Hmm.
We build these rich, intricate mental models of everything around us.
Absolutely. This ability to conceptualize and categorize objects is foundational to human cognition, really.
Foundational.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just about seeing something and labeling it a chair. It's
Right.
understanding its properties. It is a seat, it has legs, it's solid.
Right, what it's like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And its function, you sit on it, is understanding how it compares to other similar things, like a stool, a bench, or even a rock.
Yeah.
And how that knowledge helps us interact with our environment, communicate precisely about the world, and solve problems.
Simple problems like finding somewhere to sit or,
Yeah.
complex stuff like building a house.
Precisely. It underpins so much.
Right. And that understanding isn't just a big, unstructured pile of information. Our cognitive neuroscience friends tell us these mental representations are organized, often along underlying dimensions.
Dimensions.
Think about how you mentally sort things. Is it alive or not? Is it something natural you'd find outside or something human-made?
Yeah, those core distinctions.
Is it big and heavy or small and light? Is it something you eat or something you wear? These fundamental distinctions act like coordinates, helping us structure our internal world and quickly navigate our knowledge base.
Precisely. Decades of studies in cognitive science and neuroscience have consistently shown that these kinds of fundamental distinctions, animate versus inanimate, natural versus human-made, artifacts versus food, play a significant role.
A big role.
Sometimes even a privileged role in how our brains organize object knowledge. They're not just arbitrary bins. They reflect core properties that have been crucial for survival and interaction throughout human history.
So they're like the backbone.
They form the backbone of our object concepts, yeah.
Okay, so we have this amazing, complex, yet seemingly simple human ability to just know what things are and how they fit together in our mental space. Now let's bring in the world of artificial intelligence.
Right. AI.
Over the last few years, we've seen the rise of these absolutely massive models, large language models, or LLMs, and multimodal LLMs, or MLLMs. We're talking about systems like ChatGPT, Gemini, Llama, and others that seem to possess incredible capabilities in understanding and generating text. And for the multimodal ones, processing images alongside text.
And they are incredibly powerful. They demonstrate capabilities in understanding and generating complex language, analyzing and generating images, and even performing tasks that seem to require a level of reasoning.
It's pretty amazing stuff.
And they're trained on absolutely gargantuan data sets. We're talking trillions of words, vast quantities of images.
Trillions. Wow.
But unlike older AI systems that were often designed and trained for one specific task, like just recognizing faces in a photo or just translating text,
Right, very specialized.
these newer, massive models are often described as task general. You can ask them to do many different things right out of the box with little or no additional specific training.
Which brings us to the really fascinating question at the heart of this particular deep dive, and frankly, one of the big mysteries about what's happening inside these AI behemoths.
Okay?
If our brains develop these complex, structured, task-general representations of objects, organized along interpretable dimensions, can AI, specifically these massive, broadly trained LLMs and MLLMs, also develop similar task-general psychological representations of objects without being explicitly trained to do that specific thing?
So does it just emerge?
Yeah. Are they building internal maps of the world that are in some way analogous to ours, not just for completing a task, but as a fundamental way of organizing information?
That's exactly the critical question this recent research paper set out to answer. Can these complex task-general psychological representations, like the rich object concepts we rely on daily, spontaneously emerge in these massive, broadly trained models just from the sheer scale and diversity of their training data?
Right, just from being exposed to, well, everything.
Pretty much. And if they do emerge, how do they compare in detail to human cognitive processes across a wide, diverse range of objects?
So it's not just if they can do it, but how they do it compared to us.
Exactly. This isn't just about seeing if AI can do a task that requires object knowledge. It's about whether it might be developing something akin to a human-like conceptual understanding of the objects it processes.
And that's why this deep dive is such a shortcut to being well-informed. We're going to unpack this paper, look at the really clever way they decided to test this idea, see what surprising things they found, including connections to human brain activity, and figure out what it all means for the future of AI and even our understanding of our own minds.
Yeah, it's a fascinating look inside.
It's a peek into the AI black box, using tools from cognitive science. So let's dive into how they actually managed to study the mind of an AI.
Okay, so the researchers adopted a very elegant, data-driven approach, one deeply rooted in decades of classic cognitive psychology research into human similarity judgment.
Cognitive psychology, okay.
The challenge is, as you alluded to, you can't just open up a massive LLM and look inside its brain in a way that directly maps to human concept.
Right, it's not like you can just see the churner on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These models are incredibly complex, often proprietary, and their internal workings are measured in billions of parameters and high-dimensional vectors that don't have simple labels.
Billions of parameters, just mind-boggling.
So they needed a method to probe the internal mental space of these AI models and compare it to humans based on observable behavior.
Okay, so how do you probe the mind of an AI using behavior, like a cognitive psychologist?
Well, they started with a carefully selected, very diverse set of objects. They used objects from the Things database.
Things database?
Yeah, it's a collection of 1,854 common natural objects, everything from animals to tools to food to household items.
Okay, a lot of stuff.
This diversity is absolutely crucial because you need a broad sample of the world to really see how a system organizes conceptual space, not just a few specific things.
Right, you don't want to just test chairs and tables. You want to see how a toaster relates to a tree stump conceptually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the core task they used is a paradigm that's a workhorse in cognitive psychology for understanding mental representations.
Yeah.
The triplet odd one out task.
Okay, odd one out. I think I know this.
You present the participant, or in this case the AI, with 3 objects, and you ask them to choose the one that is least similar to the other 2.
Okay, I've done that before, like in IQ tests maybe. Give me an example.
Sure, imagine the triplet is dog, cat, and hammer.
Okay, easy. Hammer.
Right. The hammer is clearly the odd one out because the other 2 are animals. Or red apple, green apple, blue chair.
The chair. The apples are fruits, even though the color's different.
Exactly. This task is incredibly effective because it forces you to make a judgment based on similarity.
Right. What makes things alike?
And by analyzing millions of these judgments across many objects, you can infer the underlying dimensions and structure that people are using to organize their mental space.
So you figure out why they picked the odd one out.
Essentially, yes. What properties are they considering most important when they say 2 things are similar or different?
I get it, but with 1,854 objects, the number of possible triplets must be staggering. You couldn't possibly test every single combination.
You are absolutely right. The theoretical number of unique triplets is billions.
Billions, okay.
So they used established methods to get a representative sample that approximates the full similarity structure using a much smaller but still very large subset of trials.
Ah, sampling. Smart.
They selected triplets to cover the conceptual space efficiently. This still amounted to a truly massive data collection effort. 4.7 million unique triplet judgments were collected in total.
4.7 million.
Across both the human and AI data used in the core analysis, yes.
4.7 million odd one-out decisions. Wow. Okay, break down how they actually got that data, starting with the humans.
For the human data, they leveraged an existing large-scale data set from a previous study, which was also collected using the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform.
Okay, MTurk. Lots of people.
Exactly. This involved over 12,000 participants contributing those millions of judgments. The researchers had extensive quality control measures in place to ensure the data was reliable.
Like checking if people were just clicking randomly.
Right, excluding trials that were completed too quickly to be meaningful, or participants who showed repetitive, nonsensical patterns. Participants were compensated, demographic details collected. Importantly, they noted that while demographics were collected, relative similarity judgments in this task tend to be quite robust and consistent across different groups of people.
Okay, so that's how they got the human baseline, a huge, high-quality data set from real people. How about the AI models? How do you even ask a text-based model like ChatGPT, which is the odd one out, when you can't show it pictures.
That's where the clever adaptation comes in.
Yeah.
For the text-based LLMs, like ChatGPT 3.5 and Llama 3.1, they couldn't present images directly.
Right. No,
So instead, they gave the models textual descriptions of the objects. These descriptions were pulled from standard sources like WordNet, Google, or Wikipedia.
So giving it info it already knows from its training.
Exactly, giving the AI rich semantic information about each object. The prompt they used was carefully structured, something like, given a triplet of objects, object A, object B, which one in triplet is the odd one out? Please give the answer first and then explain your reasoning in detail.
Asking for the reasoning, too. Interesting.
Yes, that provides extra insight. And to ensure the responses were consistent and reflected the model's underlying knowledge structure rather than creative text generation.
You didn't want it making up wild stories.
Right. They set the temperature parameter, which controls the randomness or creativity of the model's output, very low, at 0.01.
Makes it more deterministic, less random.
Exactly. They did also collect a smaller but still significant number of trials from GPT-4, over 2,000, primarily for preliminary comparisons.
Why only 2,000 for GPT-4?
Basically cost. Collecting 4.7 million judgments from GPT-4 would have been prohibitively expensive at the time.
Makes sense. These models aren't cheap to run at scale.
They really aren't.
And for the multimodal models, the MLLMs, like Gemini Provision, they can see images, right?
Yes, that's the key distinction. For MLLMs like Gemini Provision and Qwen 2VL, they were shown images of the three objects in addition to being given their names.
Okay, so pictures and words. Much more like us.
Much more. The prompt was adjusted accordingly. You are shown three object images side by side labeled 1, 2, and 3. Report the image that was the least similar to the other two. Tell me your answer, just the number, its location, left, middle, right, and explain the reasons for your choice.
Got it. Location helps identify the choice.
Exactly. They process the images at a standard size, 512 by 512 pixels, and parse the model's response. They did mention having to deal with some practical challenges.
Oh, like what?
Like certain images triggering sensitive content filters in the models.
The safety layers kicking in unexpectedly.
Right, so they used workarounds like replacing problematic images to complete the full data set.
That sensitive content bit is an interesting wrinkle you don't think about. So the MLLMs are getting the direct visual input, which seems much closer to the human experience than just text descriptions for the LLMs.
It is, and that difference in input modality is a key factor to keep in mind as we look at the results. They also included data from some older or other types of AI models for comparison purposes. Models like CLIP, SimCLR, and VGG16.
Okay, so CLIP connects images and text, SimCLR learns from images without labels, and VGG16 is like a classic image recognizer.
That's right. These models don't have conversational interfaces, so they couldn't do the odd one out task directly.
So how do they get similarity data from them?
Instead, the researchers calculated the cosine distance between the model's internal feature representations of the objects to estimate their similarity judgments.
A mathematical way of comparing how the model represents things internally. Comparing to them shows how these new general-purpose LLM, SMLLMs might differ from previous AI approaches, right?
Precisely. It provides a baseline comparison. And one more thing on data. Noise ceilings.
Right, you mentioned that. Remind me what that is.
Think of the noise ceiling like this. Even if you ask the same human the same triplet multiple times, they might sometimes pick a different odd one out because of slight variations in attention or interpretation.
Humans aren't perfectly consistent.
Exactly. There's inherent variability or noise in any real-world data set. The noise ceiling estimates the maximum possible predictive accuracy any model could achieve, given that variability in the data set.
So it's the theoretical perfect score for predicting this specific data set.
That's a good way to put it. If a model predicts choices with 100% accuracy, but the noise ceiling is 95%, it means the model is performing perfectly relative to the data, which only allows for 95% consistency due to human variability.
Got it. So it's a benchmark that tells you how close the models are getting to the best possible performance achievable with this specific human data.
Okay, so they have millions of these odd one out judgments from humans and different AI models. How do they take that mountain of behavioral data and turn it into an understanding of the underlying mental dimensions or structure?
That's where the modeling method they use comes in. It's a technique called SPOS.
SPOS. Okay, let's unpack that. Sparse positive similarity embedding. Sounds like a mouthful. It is, but the core idea, when you break it down, is quite intuitive and powerful. SPOS takes the behavioral data, which object was chosen as the odd one out in each of the millions of triplets, and works backward.
Working backward from the choices.
Yes. It tries to infer a low-dimensional representation, or embedding, for each object. It searches for a set of underlying dimensions in a conceptual space.
Like finding the hidden rules.
Kind of. Such that placing objects within this space based on their properties, their weight on each dimension, allows you to best predict the original behavioral judgments.
So it's like Suppose is trying to figure out the rules or the properties the model or human is using to decide which object is different.
Exactly. Imagine you're sorting a complex pile of objects. You might be using dimensions like, is it round? Is it red? Can I eat it? Is it made of metal? Suppose looks at your sorting choices and guesses what these underlying rules or dimensions might be and how important each rule is for each object.
Okay. And what about the sparse positive part?
Sparse means it assumes that each object is mainly characterized by a small number of dimensions, not all 66. An apple isn't equally defined by, is it metal? And is it fruit?
Right. Only a few things really matter for each object.
And positive means the weight on the dimensions are positive, indicating the presence or strength of a property. This makes the resulting dimensions more interpretable. A high weight on the red dimension means the object is strongly red, not just has some arbitrary negative value like in some other methods.
Okay, that makes sense for interpretability. And why use SPOSY instead of something perhaps more familiar like PCA, principal component analysis?
SPOS has advantages for this specific task. Because it's designed around predicting similarity judgments and incorporates sparsity and positivity, it can often reveal more underlying dimensions than PCA.
More dimensions.
And the dimensions it finds tend to be more aligned with interpretable properties, much like how we think about conceptual features. Unlike PCA, which just finds general axes of variation, SPOS is looking for the specific features that differentiate objects in a way that matters for similarity.
And this behavioral method is key because, as you said, you can't just look inside these huge proprietary AI models.
Yes, that's a crucial advantage. Modern LLMs are often black boxes to varying degrees. Even if you have access, interpreting their internal state measured in thousands of dimensions per feature is incredibly challenging.
Right. Just a sea of numbers.
By inferring the representation from the model's behavior on a cognitive task, the SPOS method, inspired by human cognitive psychology, provides a way to probe the model's internal conceptual space in a human-relevant way.
So you bypass the need to directly interpret the complex internal stuff.
Exactly. It's a brilliant intersection of AI research and cognitive science methods.
Fascinating. So they use SPOSE to derive a 66-dimensional space for the LLMs and MLLMs, matching the number identified in previous human studies on object representation. Why did they settle on 66?
They found that adding dimensions beyond 66 provided only minimal additional predictive power for the similarity judgments.
Diminishing returns.
Pretty much. So 66 dimensions seems sufficient to capture the essential structure of how these systems represent this specific set of 1,854 objects.
Okay, they've collected millions of odd one-out judgments, used SPOSE to infer these 66 dimensions for humans, LLMs, and MLLMs. What did they actually find when they compared these conceptual spaces? What does the AI's map of the world look like compared to ours?
The first set of findings showed that the low-dimensional embeddings they identified for both LLM and MLLM were remarkably stable and highly predictive of the model's own judgments on new data.
Stable meaning they weren't just random chance results from one run of the algorithm.
Exactly. They performed multiple runs of the SPOSE modeling, and the resulting dimensions were largely consistent. For the LLM embeddings, 37 out of the 66 dimensions were highly reproducible across runs, with correlations above 0.90.
Wow, very consistent.
For MLLM, 31 out of 66 were similarly reproducible. This shows the inferred dimensions are robust properties of the model's representations, not just noise.
Okay, stable dimensions. And predictive, what does that tell us?
Predictive means these 66-dimensional embeddings successfully predicted the odd one-out choices on a separate set of triplets that the models had not seen during the SPOS training process.
Okay, so the dimensions they found actually work to predict new choices.
Right. The models achieved solid prediction accuracies. LLM at 56.7% correct, MLLM at 63.4%, and humans at 64.1%.
Okay, humans still slightly better, but MLLM is really close.
Very close. Now, those numbers might not sound incredibly high on their own, but remember the noise ceiling we talked about.
Right, the best possible score given human inconsistency.
The maximum possible accuracy given the human data variability was around 95%. When you look at performance relative to the noise ceiling, the low-dimensional embeddings achieve remarkable levels, up to 87.1% of optimal performance for LLM 85.9% for MLM, and 95.4% for humans.
Whoa, okay. So relative to how well anyone could possibly predict this noisy human data, the MLM is doing almost as well as humans themselves.
Pretty much, yes. That's impressive.
It really is.
And they also looked at this from a higher level, using representational similarity matrices, or RSMs.
The RSMs, okay, what are those?
An RSM is basically a grid that captures the overall similarity structure between every single pair of objects in the dataset.
Like a giant comparison chart.
Exactly. If you have 1,854 objects, the RSM is a massive matrix showing how similar object 1 is to object 2, object 3, object 2 to object 3, and so on for all combinations. It's essentially the full map of the object space as perceived by the system.
Okay, so the RSM is the complete map. And how did the AI maps compare to the human map?
They compare the RSMs predicted by the 66-dimensional SPOSY embeddings to the actual RSM derived directly from the millions of behavioral judgments. The correlation between the predicted RSM and the actual RSM was quite high.
How high?
For the LMM, it was 0.71. For the MLM, 0.85. And for humans predicting their own RSM, it was 0.9.
A correlation of 0.85 for the MLLM is extremely high. That means the conceptual map of the world inferred from the MLLM's odd one-out choices is structurally 85% similar to the map derived from millions of human judgments.
Yes, it's very close.
That suggests a fundamental alignment in how they are organizing object concepts.
It's a very strong finding, yes. It demonstrates that a relatively simple, low-dimensional embedding derived from behavioral data can capture a very large portion of the complex similarity structure present in a massive number of judgments.
So it's not just random choices.
No. It shows that the LLM and MLLM judgments aren't just superficial pattern matching. They reflect a structured, principled underlying representation.
And you mentioned they also compared the SPOSY embeddings to the original high-dimensional features from some open-source models. Why was that important?
That was a validation step, primarily using Qwen2VL, which is open source and have the chat interface and accessible internal features.
Okay, so they could look inside and talk to it.
Right. They confirmed that the SPOSY embeddings, derived from its behavior, closely approximated the predictive power of using the original high-dimensional model features directly accuracy ratios around 90%.
So the SPOS method captured most of the info from the raw features.
Yes, but here's the fascinating part. The SPOSY embeddings derived from Qwen2VL's behavioral judgments actually aligned better with the human-derived RSM.
Better than the raw features.
Yes. The SPOSY behavioral embedding had a correlation of 0.70 with the human RSM, while simply using the cosine distance on Qwen2VL's original, unprocessed internal features only got a correlation of 0.42.
Wow. So probing the model through behavior using the SPOSY method actually gave a result more like the human structure than looking at its raw internal data directly.
It seems so. It reinforces the value of the SPOSY behavioral method. It seems to extract the aspects of the AI's internal representation that are most relevant to how humans perceive similarity, even if the raw internal features are much more complex.
That's a key insight. It's not just about the raw data inside the AI, it's about how that data is organized in a way that produces human-like judgments. Okay, so the learned object spaces are stable, they predict behavior well, and the MLLM space especially looks very much like the human space at a high level. What about categories? We talked about how human similarity judgments naturally lead to objects being grouped into categories. Does the same thing pop out of the AI's embeddings?
Yes, this was another significant finding. Object categories spontaneously emerge from these low-dimensional SPOSY embeddings.
They just appear.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
To test this, they trained a simple classifier to predict which of 18 broad high-level categories, like animal, food, vehicle, clothing, an object belonged to, using only the object's 66-dimensional SPOS embedding as input.
So the models were not explicitly trained to categorize objects, but the researchers are checking if the structure within the embedding space is rich enough that categories just naturally cluster together.
Precisely. They're probing if the implicit organization of the space reflects human-like categories.
Does it?
And they found that it absolutely does. The classifier achieved high accuracy, 83.4% using LLM embeddings, 78.3% using MLLM embeddings, and 87.1% using human embeddings.
Okay, again, MLLM slightly lower than LM here, but both very high, way above chance, right?
Absolutely. All of these are significantly above chance, which would be around 10% for 18 categories.
That's incredibly strong evidence. It means that even without explicit categorization training, the AI's internal representation of objects is structured in a way that aligns strongly with human conceptual categories.
Yes.
It's not just that it can identify objects, it organizes them into meaningful groups like food or animals just from learning about their relationships through data.
Yes, it's an emergent property. They visualize this using TSNE plots.
Those cool maps that show clusters.
Exactly, which is a technique that helps you see how similar different things are by plotting points in a 2D map. Things that are mathematically similar in the high-dimensional space cluster together visually in the TSNE plot.
And did they cluster?
For both models and humans, the plot showed clear clustering of objects belonging to the same categories. Compared to older task-specific vision models like VGG16 or self-supervised ones like SimCLR, the LLMs in humans showed superior performance in this emergent categorization task.
Better than the older models.
And this finding is also consistent with the fundamental human distinctions we discussed earlier, like animate and man-made natural, which were very strongly represented in the clustering.
Right, categories emerge. But what are these 66 dimensions themselves? Can we actually understand what they represent? Are they just abstract mathematical concepts, or do they correspond to meaningful properties, like is it round, or can you eat it?
This is where the interpretability of the SPOCI dimensions really shines, and it's one of the most exciting findings. The researchers were able to visualize what each dimension represented. They did this by identifying the objects that had the highest weight on a specific dimension, and then had human experts look at those objects and assign an intuitive label to the dimension.
Yeah. So what do all these things have in common?
Pretty much.
Okay, give me some concrete examples. What kind of interpretable dimensions did they find in the AI models?
They found a fascinating mix of dimensions corresponding to both semantic, meaning-based, and perceptual, sensory-based properties.
Meaning and perception. Okay.
Semantically, there were clear dimensions like food-related, animal-related, vehicle-related electronics technology. These align very strongly with common human conceptual categories.
Those sound incredibly familiar, just like the categories we use.
Right. They also found dimensions reflecting perceptual features, although these were generally less dominant or clear in the text-based LLMs.
Less clear in the text-only models. Makes sense.
These included dimensions related to properties like hardness, value, temperature, or texture. For the MLLMs, because they process visual information.
They could see these things.
Exactly. They were much better at capturing perceptual and spatial properties. They found MLLM dimensions related to things like how crowded an object is in an image, or shape and color features like flatness, elongation, and color.
Ah, that makes perfect sense. The MLLMs, getting that visual input, are picking up on things like shape and color that the purely text-based LLMs would struggle with, or miss entirely, only getting descriptions about color or shape.
Exactly. They also found dimensions related to things like user specificity, distinguishing objects typically used by children versus adults.
Oh, interesting.
Material properties like wood or metal, and even environment, like indoor versus outdoor. If you look at Extended Data Table 1 in the actual paper, it's incredible to see the full list of labels human experts assigned to all 66 dimensions for each system.
So many different facets of objects.
And some dimensions, like animals, food, and technology, were universally recognized and strongly present across humans, LLMs, and MLLMs.
Were there differences in the dimensions? Were there some that humans picked up on but AI didn't, or vice versa?
Yes, and the differences are insightful. Humans, with our rich lifetime visual experience, naturally excel at organizing objects based on fine-grained perceptual features like color, precise shape, and texture.
Things you really need to see.
Right. These dimensions were less pronounced or sometimes less coherent in the LLM and even the MLM dimensions compared to humans. Conversely, the AI models, particularly the text-based LLMs, sometimes formed more specific semantic dimensions than humans.
More specific? Like how?
For example, an LLM might have distinct dimensions for vegetable-related or frozen treats, whereas a human might just group these under a broader food-related dimension.
That's interesting. So maybe the AI, drawing from massive text corpora, has a finer semantic granularity in some areas, distinguishing subtle semantic nuances that humans might mentally consolidate.
Plausible, yeah.
While humans have a richer, more detailed set of perceptual dimensions from direct visual experience.
That seems like a reasonable interpretation based on their findings. The researchers quantified how interpretable the dimensions were by having human experts rate them.
And were they interpretable?
The vast majority were rated as easy to interpret for all systems. 60 out of 66 for LLM, 57 out of 66 for MLLM, and 62 out of 66 for humans.
So most dimensions made intuitive sense to people.
Yes. And, critically, dimensions derived from random vectors showed no interpretability.
Ah, the control experiment.
This confirms that the interpretability comes from the learned structure within the models, not just the SPOS method itself picking up random patterns.
That's a really important control. It proves these dimensions aren't artifacts of the analysis method. They are genuine reflections of the model's internal organization. And you mentioned how objects are characterized by these dimensions?
Yes. They found that most objects in this space are characterized by a relatively small number of dominant dimensions.
Like the sparse idea again.
Exactly. An almond, for instance, might primarily load onto food-related dimensions. A satellite would load heavily on electronics technology and flying-related dimensions.
Okay.
Quantitatively, they found that only about 3 to 8 dimensions were needed for the LLM, 2 to 10 for the MLLM, and 7 to 13 for humans to explain 95–99% of the behavioral prediction performance for a given object.
So objects are sparsely represented in this dimension space. That aligns with the sparse part of SPOSI.
Exactly. It suggests that the conceptual essence of an object, in terms of its similarity to others, can be captured by a core set of defining properties.
And any differences in how many dimensions were needed?
Interestingly, yes. The LLMs seem to require slightly fewer dimensions to characterize objects compared to humans, likely because it lacks the rich perceptual distinctions.
Fewer dimensions because it knows less perceptually?
Plausibly. The MLLM required more dimensions than the LLM, but still fewer than humans, potentially indicating that while it has visual input, its integration of visual and semantic information isn't yet as complex or nuanced as human processing.
Okay, so we have stable, predictive, interpretable dimensions that capture categories and characterize objects. The MLLM's overall space looks very much like the human space. How do the model's dimensions directly compare and align dimension by dimension with human dimensions?
They used a couple of ways to assess this direct alignment. First, simple behavioral consistency. How often did the model choose the exact same object as the odd one out in a given triplet as the human majority?
Okay, just looking at the raw choices, and what did that show?
Both LLM and MLLM showed higher behavioral consistency with humans than older comparison models like CLIP or SimCLR.
Better than the older models.
Crucially, the MLLM consistency was significantly closer to human-level consistency than the LLM. Figure 5A in the paper illustrates this clearly.
So MLLM choices matched human choices more often than LLM choices did?
Yes. They also performed a preliminary comparison, showing differences still remain between ChatGPT 3.5 and GPT-4 in behavioral choices.
Oh, even different versions of GPT.
Yes, suggesting this alignment is still an area of development even between versions of the same model family.
So MLLMs are behaviorally more aligned with humans on this specific task? Did they figure out why they sometimes disagreed? Why might a human pick one odd one out and the AI pick a different one for the same triplet?
Yes. They analyzed the key dimensions that were most influential in driving the choice for humans versus models in specific triplets where they disagreed.
What drove the disagreement?
They found that differences in choices often arose because humans and models were relying on different key dimensions to make the judgment for that triplet.
Ah, using different criteria.
Exactly. For example, for a triplet where a human might rely heavily on a color dimension to pick the odd one out.
Like maybe 2 red things and 1 blue thing.
Right. The text-based LLM, lacking direct color perception, might instead rely on a semantic dimension like, is it a protective item or is it edible?
That totally makes sense. The AI is using the tools it has, semantic relationships from text for the LLM, plus some visual properties for the MLLM, and sometimes those tools lead to a different judgment call than the human's full suite of perceptual and semantic knowledge.
Exactly. Next, they looked at the relationship between the dimensions directly using cross-correlation matrices.
Okay, comparing dimension to dimension.
These matrices show how strongly each of the 66 dimensions in one system, say LLM, correlates with each of the 66 dimensions in another system, human.
What did those look like?
Messy.
Actually, the matrices reveal that the relationships were often sparse. Sparse again.
Meaning a dimension in one system usually only strongly aligned with a small number of dimensions in the other, often even a strong one-to-one mapping.
So it's not just that the overall maps are similar. Certain specific dimensions in the AI's internal space seem to directly correspond to specific dimensions in our human conceptual space.
Yes. Quantitatively, a substantial number showed strong alignment. 31 out of the 66 LLM dimensions and 42 out of the 66 MLLM dimensions strongly correlated with human dimensions, with a correlation coefficient greater than zero point 0.4.
42 out of 66 for MLLM, that's a lot.
It is. Overall, a core set of 38 dimensions were shared across all three systems: humans, LLMs, and MLLMs, meaning they captured similar patterns of variation across the objects, correlation greater than zero point 0.2.
So a big chunk of the conceptual structure is shared. Can you give a couple of examples of how the MLLM dimensions mapped to human ones? Did they always line up perfectly, or were there interesting ways they were similar but different?
There were interesting relationships. Sometimes a human dimension would correspond to a single MLLM dimension. Other times, a human dimension might be split across multiple MLLM dimensions, or vice versa.
Split or combine?
For instance, a human dimension labeled fluid-related might correspond to two separate MLLM dimensions, one related to containers and another more directly fluid-related.
Ah, the AI made a finer distinction there.
Perhaps. The MLLM was also much better than the LLM at aligning with human dimensions related to shape, texture, and spatial properties like grainy or round or elongated,
The visual stuff.
powerfully illustrating the importance of visual input in developing these perceptual dimensions that align with humans. The LLM dimensions, lacking that visual input, were more purely semantic, distinguishing things like frozen treats from hot drinks, but struggling with visual distinctions.
This is incredibly detailed. It's not a perfect conceptual clone, but there's significant specific overlap, and the differences are often explainable by the AI's input modality, text versus text plus image. And the most mind-bending part, the paper also connected these AI representations to human brain activity. How did they do that?
This is arguably the most compelling piece of evidence for the similarity. They leveraged existing large-scale fMRI data from the Natural Scenes Dataset, NSD,
fMRI, okay, brain scans.
where human participants viewed thousands of object images while their brain activity was recorded. They then used sophisticated neuroimaging analysis methods,
Fancy stats on brain scans.
primarily searchlight RSA and voxel-wise encoding, to compare the similarity structure of objects as represented in the AI model Stowe's embeddings to the similarity structure of objects as reflected in patterns of brain activity across the human brain.
Okay, break down those methods for us non-neuroscientists. Searchlight RSA and voxel-wise encoding.
Think of it like this. Searchlight RSA is like shining a small virtual spotlight across the brain. It looks at the pattern of activity in a tiny sphere of brain tissue around a specific point.
A tiny patch of brain.
It asks, how similar are the brain activity patterns for these three objects in this little patch of the brain? It calculates a miniature RSM for that brain region.
A local brain map.
Then it compares that brain RSM to the model's SPOS-derived RSM. If the patterns match, if objects that are similar in the AI's embedding space also evoke similar brain activity patterns in that brain region, you get a high correlation.
So checking if the AI map matches the local brain map.
Exactly. You repeat this process by moving the spotlight across the entire brain to create a map of where the alignment is strongest. Voxel-wise encoding is a related method that tries to build a model to predict the activity of individual brain pixels, voxels, based on the object features in the model's embedding space.
Predicting brain activity from the AI's dimensions.
Essentially, yes. Both methods look for correspondences in the structure of object representation between the AI and the brain.
Okay, so they're seeing if the map of object similarity derived from the AI models based on its behavior looks like the map of object similarity that exists in the activity patterns of the human brain when looking at those objects.
Exactly. And results were striking.
What did they find?
The object similarity structure derived from the human SPOSI embeddings, as you'd expect, aligns strongly with activity patterns across large parts of the human visual cortex. No surprise there.
Right. Human behavior matches human brains. Makes sense.
But more surprisingly, the object similarity structure from the MLLM embeddings also aligns strongly with brain activity patterns, often in the same regions as humans.
The MLLM map matched the brain map, too.
Yes. And this alignment was particularly strong in specific category-selective brain regions already known to be involved in processing certain types of objects.
Like face areas or place areas.
Exactly. Areas like the EBA, extrastriate body area for bodies, the PPA, parahippocampal place area, and RSC, retrosplenial cortex for scenes places, and the FFA, fusiform face area for faces, even though this study focused on general objects.
So the AI's internal representation structure, derived purely from training on text and images and then analyzed via this behavioral task, aligns with the way our brains are specifically wired to process certain categories of objects. That is genuinely wild.
Yes, the cortical maps in the paper visually demonstrated this. The peaks of alignment for the MLM embeddings in the brain corresponded remarkably well to these category-selective regions, mirroring the pattern seen with the human embeddings.
Wow. And quantitatively, how strong was the match?
Quantitatively, the MLM achieved approximately 85% of the human performance level in Searchlight RSA, and nearly matched human levels in voxel-wise encoding.
85% of human level in the Searchlight method and nearly 100% in the voxel-wise, showing a very high degree of structural similarity to brain representations. The LLM also showed significant brain alignment, though generally lower than MLLM and Searchlight RSA, 60% of human level, but still quite high in voxel-wise encoding. 90%.
But even the text-only model showed brain alignment, especially with that voxel-wise method, but the MLLM with vision was clearly closer overall.
That's the pattern, yes.
That provides really compelling evidence. It's not just that the AI models behave similarly to humans in this task. Their underlying organizational structure, especially for the multimodal models, seems to resonate with the fundamental ways our own brains organize object concepts. This isn't just abstract math matching, it's connecting AI to human neural processing.
It provides strong converging evidence that the object representations emerging in these large AI systems, particularly MLLMs, share fundamental structural similarities with human conceptual knowledge, similarities that are measurable even against neural activity patterns.
Okay, we've gone through the core question, the methods, the massive data collection, the clever SPOSY modeling, and these incredibly detailed and frankly mind-blowing findings, including the brain links. So what does this all mean? What's the big picture? So what here? Why should a listener care that an AI's odd one-out choices can be mapped to interpretable dimensions that look like our own and even correlate with brain activity?
Well, the biggest takeaway is that these complex AI models, particularly multimodal ones, are spontaneously developing object concept representations that are surprisingly structured and similar to ours.
Okay.
Characterized by interpretable dimensions that relate directly to human behavior and brain activity. What does that mean? Several key implications.
Let's dig into those implications. First, what does it tell us about machine intelligence itself?
It helps us peer into the black box and understand how these models are learning and representing the world internally, beyond just predicting text or identifying objects in photos.
It's like getting a glimpse of their thought process.
Kind of, yeah. It suggests they're building something akin to internal conceptual models. This understanding is crucial for building better, more sophisticated AI. If we understand how they represent concepts, we can potentially design future models that are more aligned with human cognition.
Making AI more intuitive.
Making artificial systems feel more intuitive and natural for us to interact with, yes.
So it's not just about building AI that performs tasks. It's about building AI that might understand the world in a way that's compatible with how we understand it. That seems like a huge leap for human-AI collaboration.
Absolutely. Imagine AI assistants, robots, or interfaces that share fundamental schemas or ways of organizing knowledge with us.
Like being on the same page, conceptually.
Exactly. Identifying these shared conceptual structures could drastically improve human-machine communication and collaboration. If an AI genuinely represents food or tool or animal, using dimensions similar to yours, communicating about those concepts becomes much more seamless and intuitive.
And the fact that these dimensions are interpretable, that they correspond to things like food-related or round or for children, does that offer us new ways to interact with or guide the AI?
Yes, this is another exciting potential application. The interpretability suggests we might be able to guide AI reasoning by explicitly referencing these dimensions in our prompts or instructions.
Like telling it how to think about something.
Kind of. The study authors showed in their supplementary analyses that by adding phrases to the prompt like focus on the material or consider the purpose, they could influence the model's odd one-out choice for a given triplet.
Nudging its decision.
Influencing it to align more closely with human reasoning that prioritize that specific dimension.
That's incredibly powerful. Being able to nudge the AI towards a more human-like way of thinking about things by highlighting specific conceptual dimensions.
It could be a significant step towards making AI's internal reasoning processes more transparent and steerable, aligning its thought process more closely with human intuition on a conceptual level.
Makes sense. And what about benchmarking?
And finally, yes, the sheer scale of the data sets collected in this study, millions of behavioral judgments, provides a valuable new benchmark for evaluating and comparing future AI models.
Not just on accuracy, but
Not just on output performance, but on how well their internal conceptual representations align with human cognition.
how does this study fit into the broader context of AI research and our understanding of the mind?
It connects fascinatingly with ideas from other fields. In theoretical neuroscience and complex systems, there are concepts like the low-rank hypothesis or the distributed information bottleneck.
Catchy names.
They propose that complex biological and artificial systems, when processing high-dimensional data, might naturally converge on discovering fundamental, low-dimensional structures or features that are essential for efficient representation and task performance.
So systems naturally find the simplest, most useful ways to organize info.
That's the idea. This study provides empirical evidence that AI might be doing something similar to the brain in organizing object concepts, finding a core set of dimensions that are both efficient for predicting similarity and interpretable to humans.
So maybe there are just fundamental good ways to organize object knowledge that both brains and AI are finding.
It's a tantalizing possibility. It also aligns with a growing body of research showing connections between AI models and brain activity, or the increasingly recognized tight link between language and vision representations in both humans and machines.
Language and vision being linked.
The fact that both LLMs, text only, and MLLMs, text plus image, develop similar fundamental conceptual structures, even while differing on things like perceptual dimensions, suggests this convergence isn't just due to simple correlations in the training data.
Something deeper.
Perhaps reflects something deeper about the fundamental nature of efficient representation learning itself.
And using the behavioral method, SPOCI, to study AI, that feels like a major contribution in bridging AI and cognitive science methodologies.
Absolutely. It demonstrates the power of borrowing techniques from cognitive psychology, which has a long history of inferring mental representations from behavior to probe the internal world of complex AI systems where direct internal analysis is difficult.
Using old tools for new problems.
It's a wonderful example of the exciting insights that can emerge from the intersection of these fields.
So it's clear this is a groundbreaking study, but no study is the final word. What were the limitations, and what are the next steps for this research?
One key limitation they noted is that the study focused on specific versions of models available at the time, primarily ChatGPT 3.5 and Gemini Pro Vision v1.0.
Right, the models tested might already be old news soon.
Exactly. Future work needs to test other state-of-the-art models like GPT-4v, Claude, or newer versions of Gemini and open source models to see if these findings generalize across different architectures and training regimes. Models are evolving incredibly rapidly.
That's a fair point. AI is a moving target. Anything else?
They also discussed the potential impact of prompt design, although they carefully designed theirs to be clear and consistent. A crucial point is the difference between providing AI with object-level annotations, abstract text descriptions for LLMs, versus implicit image-level information, the visual details processed by MLLMs.
The text versus image difference again.
The significantly better alignment of MLM embeddings with both human behavior and brain activity strongly highlights the importance of visual information, in addition to text, in shaping conceptual representations that are aligned with human perception and cognition.
So text alone gets AI part of the way to human-like conceptual understanding, but actually seeing the world seems key to getting much closer, particularly for those perceptual dimensions.
That seems to be a strong implication.
And what about future directions? Where does this research go next?
They suggest an exciting possibility, fine-tuning models on large data sets of triplet odd-one-out tasks that include not just the human choice, but also the human's reasoning behind that choice.
Teaching the AI why humans made the choice.
Exactly. Training the AI not just on what humans decide is the odd one out, but why they decide it, potentially emphasizing certain dimensions or properties in the process, could be a way to further improve model-human alignment in conceptual organization.
Training AI not just on the answer, but on the human thought process. That would be absolutely fascinating.
It could offer a path towards building AI that not only arrives at similar conclusions, but does so via a reasoning process that is more transparent and understandable to humans.
This deep dive has really opened up a window into the AI black box, showing us that these massive models aren't just statistical engines predicting patterns. They are developing internal maps of the world, and those maps, particularly for the multimodal ones, are starting to look surprisingly, even compellingly, similar to the maps in our own heads.
It fundamentally challenges us to think about what constitutes understanding and the nature of intelligence, both artificial and biological.
If AI can learn to see and categorize the world along dimensions that resonate with our own deepest cognitive structures, does this change how we think about AI intelligence? Is this just sophisticated correlation, or is it something more?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
And what does it mean for future collaboration when AI might genuinely organize concepts like food, tool, or danger in a way that mirrors our own fundamental mental structures?
It suggests a potential for more intuitive, natural interaction, but it also raises profound questions about the shared space between human and artificial minds and where the boundaries might lie.
We've seen how a deep dive into something as seemingly simple as judging object similarity can reveal surprising parallels between the internal world of AI and our own, even touching on how our brains process objects.
It's a powerful look at the emergent properties of large AI systems and their potential to serve as tools for understanding the fundamental mechanisms of cognition, both in machines and in ourselves.
So, next time you effortlessly pick out the odd object from a group, or interact with an AI that seems to understand what you mean, take a moment.
Yeah.
Consider how your own brain effortlessly navigates a world full of objects, instantly knowing what they are and how they relate. Now consider that AI is starting to build internal maps of that same world, and those maps are looking more and more like ours.
It really makes you think.
What new possibilities and new questions does that open up for the future of AI, and perhaps even our understanding of ourselves?